All right, welcome back, everyone, and you are joining the Dank History Show
Woo!
with our host,
I'm Katie Cooper.
and I am Bradley Cooper.
It's been a while. It's been like a month.
Yeah,
Has it been 2 months? I haven't
I
kept
think
up.
it's been close to 2 months because July the 4th was the last one we
I
did?
think so. We stopped around the 4th of July.
Yeah. So for those of you
Ooh,
who didn't know,
it's almost September.
yeah, it is. Wow, time flies. Time does fly and becomes historical very quickly.
Good one.
That
Good
was
one.
that was a dad joke. That was. So anyway, so for those of you, which probably most of you that weren't aware, this is the Dank History Show, and we talk about history on here. But we do it in a little different way than you might experience, in high school or college, because a lot of people learn history as kind of a dead thing in school. It's just a bunch of dates, names, and events all on a sheet of paper that you have to memorize. Then you have to say why there was a Bacon Rebellion in the 1700s.
That has nothing to do with pork, which made me sad when I figured that out.
Yeah, it was just a guy named Bacon.
I'm sorry.
And yeah, so it's all not all that interesting. And while you might learn how some things are connected, that they're all kind of, viewed separately. The Revolutionary War, no one talks about that in reference to the Civil War and how they influence each other.
Everyone thinks that we like to try and compartmentalize things.
Yes.
And we put them in little boxes so we can figure it out easier. But we don't realize everything is kind of a web. It's kind of a timey-wimey, to borrow from Doctor Who.
That's a good reference. And yeah, that's really how people tend to view both things in their life and history. And as such, many people grow up kind of thinking, all this stuff is kind of irrelevant to my life. Which actually, this trend continues in college, as many courses, and I've had a few history courses, they don't really focus on the more interesting aspects of history, but continue in the same pattern of you having to memorize dates, memorize people, and then you have to have really difficult exams. Like, I'm not joking when I say out of all my introduction classes, the ones with the hardest test were the history classes.
Oh, my world history was my lowest grade.
Yeah, and that's crazy because it was just like, the way I remember the test was you had to write in incredibly great detail about some event or something like that. How are the tests for you, Katie?
There were a lot of details, and I'm not a super huge detail person, so I only did okay on them. I could put down the major points, but anything other than that was kind of left.
Yeah, so we don't want to go to the granular level of the details, but we really want to focus on general things and interesting things. And let me give you a few examples of what we're going to be looking at. So, history is not a dead thing. It is an active, alive, changing field that we're gaining new information for every day. And not only
kind of meta.
Yeah, and not only that, but history is made up of everyone. It's not just, the big pharaoh, the king or whatever. From the day you were born all the way back to ancient Egypt, there is history involved, and there are countless things to learn about it. And it doesn't just have to involve the great figures in the past, but also some lesser-known people. Such as there was this nun in the Middle Ages who made a fake nun with some straw and stuck it in her bed so she could escape. Or the guys who first tried to test out flying by jumping off of temples while wearing feather wings.
Those poor guys. But they paved the way for future aviation.
Exactly.
Without them jumping off the window, we would not have the... Oh, I already forgot. And we talked about them. The brothers. Thank you.
Wilbur brothers, yes.
Yeah. I'm sorry, guys. It's been 2 months.
It's been a while.
I forgot all of my history.
I need to go back to class.
I apologize.
Back to the Dank class. So there are always these new things to cover about history because we always find new findings, or even just we have fresh perspectives on the events. So this show in particular is going to focus on some of the names we know. We're going to talk about George Washington, Alexander the Great, Cleopatra, etc. But you're also going to focus on lesser-known characters, as well as topics you wouldn't hear in a traditional history class, like games, including both the video game variety and sports.
And games have been around for a while. Well, since the dawn of time.
Yeah, people have always been playing games. We have, really ancient chess sets, and they weren't, chess as we know it. It might be like there's one little group that's surrounded and you have to get them off the board or something like that.
Right.
So there's lots of really cool games. And we're also going to talk about, to borrow from, I can't remember the name of that movie that has Keanu Reeves in it.
The Matrix?
No, the one before that. Bill and Ted's Most Excellent Adventure.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to talk about some historical babes and studs and how they're relevant to us today.
So exciting.
I mean, these are some historical babes.
Oh, the 80s. Oh, that hurts.
That's an example of dank history, though. Because
that's as dank as it gets.
Because they're trying to pass a history test in case you all haven't seen the movie. And Keanu Reeves and another guy who no one remembers.
That's not nice. He's still doing things, I think.
He still is doing things, but
give me 1 second. Google time. Keep going.
Yeah,
I'll find
so in this movie, they're just hanging out in a Circle K, and they're not doing well in their history test. And some guy comes back in time and to tell them that in the future
Alex Winter. I apologize, Alex Winter.
Yeah.
To be fair, I forgot about the brothers at Kitty Hawk, and right now I can't even remember their names again.
Wilbur Orville, and I can't remember the other guy's name.
Thank you.
Wright brother.
Right.
Yeah,
there was only 2 of them, and then they had a sister.
They had a sister named Catherine.
See, guys, this is why you have to really learn your history, or you're gonna forget.
Exactly. And in this movie, they so this guy comes back from the future and is like, you need to learn your history and you need to meet all these people. So they meet up with, I think it's like Joan of Arc, Cleopatra, Genghis Khan, Napoleon, a couple of others. And then they have a huge rock show. Remember, this is the 80s.
Of course, everything ends in a rock show.
Yep.
I wish I'd lived in the 80s.
And it was most excellent.
If only it actually happened in the 80s where everything ended in a rock show.
Yeah. And they all met at Circle K.
Was it a Circle K?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Circle K's been around for a while.
Was it a Circle K or a 7-Eleven?
No, it was a Circle K.
Okay.
Yeah. The only reason I remember that is because of the epic rap battles. Remember where the Wright brothers and no, it wasn't the Wright brothers. It was Lewis and Clark, played by Rhett and Link.
Oh, and Bill and Ted went up against each other.
That's another really funny YouTube channel that needs more love. It's getting more raps though. So anyway, back to history. So in order to start on any historical matter, we have to understand what is history anyway. Now you might think
what is history?
Yeah, what is it?
I mean, like, the start of the show is technically history.
Yeah, and what is dank?
If you think about it too long, your brain will explode, so don't think about it too long.
But thinking about it too long is what I do for a living.
That's fair. Keep going.
So you might think, well, history is pretty self-explanatory. It's anything that happened in the past. But the problem with that is if we say that, that would mean dinosaurs are historical.
Oh, aren't they? Dinosaurs are technically historical.
You know, if there's one thing that the show is it's not about dinosaurs. That's right, Let's Talk Dinosaurs. I am calling you out. Just kidding. Let's Talk Dinosaurs was a lovely show. And
okay, so just because something wasn't history didn't mean that it actually existed.
No, it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean it didn't happen, because when we talk about history, we divide it into history and prehistory.
Oh, that's right. That's why they're called the prehistorical era.
Yes.
Before you could write stuff down.
Yes.
Because T-Rexes didn't know English.
No. T-Rexes couldn't write. I mean, could you write with little hands like that?
Are you making fun of my shortness?
No, I'm talking the T-Rexes. Their little arms.
They could do it with their teeth.
I mean,
I don't think they had good enough control because their heads were very
probably
big.
not, and their jaws are too strong for that.
Ask Billy.
They'd probably snap the giant pencil. Unless it was made from a triceratops horn or something.
Well, even then, haven't they been broken by
T-Rexes? I mean, they have
I have no idea.
They have the most powerful bite of any land creature.
I don't know. Ask Billy.
Well, ask Billy. For those of you who don't know, Billy Reed was a good friend of ours.
He's not gone. He went to... No. Where did he go?
Anyway, Billy Reed was a very good friend of ours who...
He's in grad school. He's not here.
He was a very good friend of ours.
Stop. The last show we were on was Let's Talk Dinosaurs.
Dinosaurs. Charlie Sandifer of the previous show, Heroes on the Horizon, was also a member of.
Yes. And it broke up.
Yep.
Now we kind of do our own thing.
Yep. So the way we define history, like Katie mentioned, isn't based on whether something happened, but on the invention of writing. So everything before the invention of writing is considered prehistorical, and So writing is probably a more revolutionary human invention than the wheel or just, how to create fire. And the reason why that is because it allowed humans to tell stories in a way that anyone could read or experience. And before that, it was just basically the community you were in. The only way you know any stories was if, your parents told you or, the elders told you. But with the writing being invented, now it could be stored, it could be preserved, and it could be passed on to other people, even people who weren't necessarily in your community or, even part of your nation. And writing all began in ancient Sumer, and that is in modern-day Iraq. So
It looks like summer without two N's.
Yeah, it's Sumer. And this is actually very interesting to make a point because writing was invented about 5.5 to about 6,000 years ago. So
Give or take. Nobody really knows how old anything is.
So it's kind of interesting when someone like, Ken Ham says, the world is 6,000 years old. And in a sense, he's kind of right because civilization and writing didn't really begin until 6,000 years ago. So for us to experience it, just a little interesting idea I had.
That's an interesting thought.
So Sumer,
Theory.
which was basically, Sumer wasn't really a nation or a place. It was really a series of cities that were self-governing. And there were tens of thousands of people that would live in these individual cities. Some of them we might know today. There's one that was called Ur.
Yes.
And Babel.
Yes.
So
we know about these because these were written down.
Yeah. And these cities were often centered around a temple called a ziggurat. And these were places where they believed the gods would dwell. And that's, for a side note, the Tower of Babel, as described in Genesis, probably would have looked like a ziggurat of some sorts.
Is that why it looks the way it does in the picture Bibles?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Ziggurats were kind of like, they were almost like pyramids, but they were more cylindrical, if that makes sense.
So it's almost like Leaning Tower, at least in some of them, but not really.
Yes, exactly. But temples were more than just places for the gods to come down. They were sort of viewed as stepping stools for the gods. They also served as storehouses. So, during good times, people would bring in their goods like grain, beer, or other products. And beer back then wasn't like it is today. It was basically like, grain that had been strained.
Right.
And people had to drink it almost through like a straw.
Oh, yeah.
A wooden straw, because otherwise they get chunks of grain in their mouth. Like porridge.
I feel like I've heard that some people to make beer took like a piece of bread and they put it in water and let it sit for a while.
Yes.
And then they had to strain it.
Yeah, and some people believe that almost happened accidentally, that people would just leave bread out in the sun for too long, then they'd come back and be like, oh, I'll try this.
Yeah, and then so I've got the plague. I don't know what it is. I've also heard that that's how tea was invented too. That it was an accident that like leaves fell into water, but we don't know. It could have just been a tall tale.
And that is interesting because it's not normally something you would think of. You wouldn't think to, put leaves just out in this water or put
I say that as I'm
food.
drinking my tea.
Yes, or like bread in water, but. So, anyway, people would bring in their goods into these ziggurats, and during bad times, the temples would sell or give away those goods so the city wouldn't starve.
Right.
In order to keep track of these objects, the priests, the scribes in those places would do a little drawing. They would, for example, like maybe draw a little picture of grain so they would know that someone brought in grain at a certain time. And the reason why they did this is so they could have records, okay, we've got this much grain.
These were the first records.
Yes.
Before words.
Yes. And what happened with those symbols is slowly they got simpler and more symbolic until scribes started to agree upon that these symbols would just represent certain objects.
And that's why people thought that people weren't very artistic.
Yeah, it wasn't so much artistic. It was just, it's so tiring just to have to draw this thing.
It takes too long.
Yeah, eventually you're just going to make a little mark or something like that.
Exactly. Kind of like emojis.
Yeah. And in time, and this is very interesting, these symbols became associated not just with that object itself, but with the word for itself.
Ah.
So the symbol for cow became a Y just to say a cow in general, rather than a specific cow.
So were they like so detailed that they would have the specific cow's markings before?
I don't think they would have the specific markings, but it was more like that represented this cow that was brought into the temple
This is
at this time.
Johnny's cow,
Yeah,
but not Craig's cow.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And in Sumerian, and this is something that worked very well for the first written language, most of the words are single syllables in concepts. So they were single syllables, and the concepts were built by putting those words together. So ku, which was the word for food, when you put together with a, which was the word for water, you got fish, because water food.
I mean, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Whenever you think you're getting seafood, you generally think like the whole broad spectrum of seafood.
Exactly. And this was helpful because when all your symbols are single syllable words, it's easy to start thinking of these symbols as being a sound for a word. Mm-hmm. So from here, you can string sounds together to build all sorts of words. For example, like sickle plus grain equals harvest.
That makes a lot of sense. You use a sickle to get your grain, and that's when you have it in your hand.
Exactly. And from there, it really got interesting through other developments. For example, the first Sumerian tablets we have, and just as a side note, the reason why we have these tablets from so long ago is because they were all done on clay. And clay, unlike paper, when something burns or something gets buried, the clay is preserved.
That's interesting.
So that's why
Do you think there could have been writing before then, but it just wasn't preserved?
That's possible. It certainly is.
Probably not like paper, because I don't think it was invented at that point, but
No.
maybe like on the ground. They could have been doing something to like symbolize whatever they were doing.
Yeah, they could have.
Or paint. Not really paint, but like taking, I don't know, like flowers and crushing them up and then putting it on the wall. That doesn't stay.
Yeah, there definitely could have been stuff like that. And we have found drawings of cavemen in the caves, but we just don't have any evidence if there was any writing before then.
Gotcha.
Now, we do know that there were writing systems that developed alongside this one that were probably simultaneous or close to it. Mm-hmm. But this is the first one we really know for sure existed.
Right.
And at first, when they first wrote, they wrote it from top to bottom, because it was originally a list, and when you write your
makes
list, you
sense.
put number 1, do this, number 2, do that.
Well, if it's only to keep track of things, there's no point in making it left to right or right to left. Just
Yeah.
go up to down.
But this presents some problems because they used wet clay to, make their markings.
Oh. So did it affect when they would write the first one and then they'd try to go to the next one, did it affect it? Is that what the problem was?
Yes, the problem is that with wet clay, okay, you're writing, vertically, but if you accidentally set your hand down, you can just ruin the clay because your hand just gets imprinted in. Sorry, I shouldn't have slammed on the table.
You're okay.
But, that can ruin the whole wet clay, and you have to go get another one.
You couldn't even start over. You'd have to get another one?
Well, I mean, you could try, but if your hand slipping would probably ruin a huge portion of it.
That's sad.
Yeah.
And then you'd have to start all over.
Yeah. But the scribes found out, if you write from left to right, it's much harder to make that mistake because your hand's moving across the clay tablet so that...
Interesting.
So
Did they start left to right?
They started up to down.
I mean, after the up to down.
Yes, we know that all of a sudden they start drawing from left to right.
That's interesting. So they didn't do right to left?
No.
Like the Japanese?
Yes, they did left to right, yeah.
That's interesting.
And a lot of our modern languages are sort of based on that for a reason. Mm-hmm. Now, initially, a lot of priests didn't like this because they were used to reading from top to bottom, and this is where we get another one of our interesting innovations. So what the scribes did is they just took the symbols and they rotated them 90 degrees.
Why?
Because that way people could read it either from top, they could turn it and read it from top to bottom or left to right.
That's interesting.
But what eventually ended up happening was by flipping 90 degrees, these pictures became more abstract and looked much more like letters rather than pictures.
Okay.
And then from there, they added all sorts of other things, like little marks called, and this is a term that I looked up, it's called determinatives.
Determinatives.
And that determines what part of speech the word is.
Okay, so...
Like noun, pronoun,
Right, I was
verb.
about to say that. My brain is a little fried right now.
That's okay. It's a long,
I mean, I forgot the
long
Wright
day.
brothers.
That's not rat.
And we talked about them. That's what makes me so sad. I'm like, I know who you guys are, I promise.
Well, he talked about, what were the names of the other people we talked about who flew?
I don't even remember.
There was that woman who flew.
Amelia Earhart? We've talked about
Yeah,
her, didn't
Amelia
we?
Earhart, but there was the other one.
Oh, was it Brown?
I think her name was Brown.
It was like, hold on. I'm looking it up real quick.
Yeah. So from there, really, you have a very abstract writing system. And then they start to move beyond just writing lists to writing down stories. And one of the first stories we actually get from ancient Sumer is a story called the Epic of Gilgamesh.
Oh, the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's where everybody thinks that an epic tale, it has to follow this pattern.
Yes. And that's a story about a guy who was supposedly two-thirds a god and one-third a human. Don't ask me how that genetics works, and he was trying to achieve immortality, Gilgamesh. And that what's interesting about that story is it contains many other stories that are also passed along. For example, Gilgamesh mentions a big flood happening. There's a Noah-like character in it. So it's a very interesting story. And we can see, how this writing system, that all it started was just, someone just scribbling a little drawing of a picture of grain. It grew from that to now we have, full tales of
It
their
was
societies.
Jill Brown, by the way.
Jill Brown, yes, that's right. That was the first African-American woman to
Yes.
become a pilot.
Yes.
For those who don't
For
know.
those who are suddenly distracted by going from writing to
Right.
aviation, we are back on writing.
Well, writing is how we got to aviation.
See, it's all connected. It makes sense.
I mean, if we didn't know how to write things down, no one would learn how to fly. No one would know how to make, what's it called? What's it called when you plan for like something?
Blueprint?
A blueprint.
I knew what a blueprint was.
Yeah, and I'm fried now. I can't. So what's interesting from that is that there were other writing systems that also developed independently after this. And there were places like China, Mesoamerica, and India, and other places that began to develop other writing systems. And some places were definitely influenced by each other, like the Indian writing system and the other ancient Near Eastern was definitely influenced by Sumerian. Mm-hmm. So all this stuff where I've told you about how writing really determines history, this does have a certain problem with it, because when we look at a place before writing came, we obviously have to acknowledge that they have a history too. Like we could look at caves, villages, or even cities, or like civilizations that never developed writing, period. So the way we look at the history of those places is we really have to look at the architecture and the goods they made, as well as some of the art they left. So we might be able to guess from like a certain area's village that they like certain animals, because maybe they had, I don't know, a donkey or something on a lot of stuff.
Right.
So maybe they worship donkeys or something like that. Or
They just had a lot of donkeys. I mean, you never know.
You never know. Or we can determine from like caveman drawings of them hunting a mammoth that they hunted in groups.
Well, you would need a lot of people to get a mammoth.
Yeah, you would. It just makes sense. However, what writing gives us is it gives us something else entirely. With writing, we can see how people, in their own time, understood themselves and the world around them, understood morality and, the divine, understood their history and the key figures within it. And it just gives us that direct witness into a world we would normally have to make educated guesses about.
Because we weren't there. We don't know any. Like, even the dinosaurs, we really don't know enough
No.
to really say anything.
No, all we can go off of is just some fossils. I mean, we can take educated guesses and we can look maybe at look at how they were structured, their bones were
Right.
structured, and make, theories. But for example, we still don't know if a T-Rex was fast or slow.
Right.
There's a lot of models that look at it, but we don't know for sure.
Right. Whereas with writing, as humanity, we can go back and look at how they thought,
Yes.
what they did. I don't know, how they did ceremonies.
And, I mean, we can look at people's journals to see what they thought. Now, before I, start going crazy about how writing's the best thing ever,
Says the editor.
says the editor, there are a few issues with written works, and this goes throughout all of history. For example, like I mentioned before, there are a few issues with, it can make us really ignore those societies that didn't really have writing, like the Native American tribes, or even the Celtic tribes.
Yeah, that's true.
And a lot of problems with that is we only get their stories or what they thought through the people who conquered them.
Well, they say that history is written by the winners.
Yes, and that's also a big issue to deal with, that a lot of times those works we're getting are biased.
And that's fair if you're only getting one side of the story.
Yes, and that's why we really need to be careful. Another issue at play here is that just because someone wrote that down doesn't mean it's automatically 100% true. We should all know this. We've all been on Twitter and Facebook. We've all seen the
Social
stuff
media.
that's the fake news and the stuff that's, been debunked. Like, I think there was that one of like, do you remember the Momo thing?
Yeah, the Momo thing.
That there
it
was-
was very, very, it was just an art piece. It wasn't really anything.
Yeah, it was supposedly something that
Somebody took it and ran with it and got everybody scared.
that they claimed it would pop up in kids' Fortnite games or something and hack into their
And
Minecraft.
that's, I mean, I'm
servers.
sure somebody later probably figured out how to do that, but that's so sad.
Right.
It was an unnecessary scare.
So one question a lot of people have is, okay, how can we know whether it should be trusted or not? If we're looking at, something somebody written down, how do we know it's real or it's garbage?
Well, even today we have trouble with that.
Yeah, it's a modern struggle. And to do that, well, we have to use some good research tools. So the first thing we have to do is examine how the piece of writing lines up with other facts we know. For example, if they're writing about a certain place in a certain time, does what they're saying line up about what we know about archaeology?
Yes.
So if they're talking about a city, if it says a city exists, did that city exist at that time? And this can get very complicated, especially the further back you go when a lot of stuff, disappears because of fire or conquest or, just a flood or
And
something
we
like
may
that.
not have dug deep enough to find them.
Right. The second thing you want to look at is, do we know when the work was written? And this can also be hard to determine, but we really want to try to figure out, was this written pretty close to when the event happened, or has a long time passed since then? And the problem with that is that the more time passes, the more chances for the real history to get a little dimmer and for more hearsay and legends to sort of sneak in. A good example of this is the King Arthur.
Oh, King Arthur.
We have some somewhat early documents that describe someone named Arthur living in the 400s that did some stuff. But then the longer along you get all these more legendary stuff, like King Arthur pulling the sword out of the water and
Oh, it went from water to the stone?
I'm not sure which one came first, but the sword and the stone was not actually Excalibur. It was
My childhood ruined.
Yeah, that one was important. That he pulled that one so he could be king, but the special sword Excalibur was given to him by the Lady of the Lake.
My childhood ruined. I am so sad now.
Yeah,
I was so happy. I
that's a
loved
sad one.
Excalibur.
well, I mean, Excalibur was given.
I know, but it wasn't pulled from the stone.
No, so
So he had
sad.
two stones? Two stones.
He had-
Two swords?
Yeah, he had two swords. Yeah, I don't
Okay.
think the one out from the stone was named.
I'm so-
But I think might have been the one of his dad, not Arthur Pendragon. It was someone else.
I thought, well, legend is that Merlin had it grow out of the ground, which clearly didn't happen because it was of legend.
Right. And Merlin has actually come up with a lot of countries like legends. Like even France has Merlin legends.
Okay.
Like they claim that Merlin had predicted Joan of Arc. So, yeah.
Okay.
So, getting back to real history.
Real history, not King Arthur.
Not King Arthur. Although
I sit and weep.
we should definitely do an episode on King Arthur. Just talking about the...
Didn't we briefly go over it?
No,
When we
didn't.
talked about the royal family, I thought we mentioned it.
No, we didn't talk about King Arthur.
Where was I?
We talked about William the Conqueror and Richard the Lionheart, which are kind of, Richard the Lionheart is...
Never mind.
Richard the Lionheart probably...
You and I have had this conversation. We have not done it on the air.
No, we have not done it on the air. Though Richard Lionheart would probably be the closest to, a King Arthur figure in British history.
Gotcha.
So another thing we have to look at is, do we have any idea what biases the author might have had? For example, someone writing in Persia about the Babylonians probably wouldn't have had a whole lot of positive things to say about them. Likewise, someone in Greece writing about the Persians, because they did a lot of fighting, wouldn't have many positive things to say.
Right.
But sometimes they can give us some good information, like Herodotus, who wrote about the wars between the Greeks and Persians. He was biased, but he was fairly fair for his time. Fairly fair, I think.
Fairly fair. Fairly fair.
And next, can we compare other works to it? For example, if we have letters about the Revolutionary War from people like George Washington, can we compare it with letters from the British side, such as one sent by General Thomas Gage? Are there times they contradict each other, but what do they agree on?
Well, you're going to have different point of views.
Oh, yeah.
Especially if you think both sides are fighting for justice.
Oh, yeah. That's why it's important to have both sides if you can. If you can. Sometimes we just only have one side and we have to do the best with what we know from it.
And it's hard to find, it's important to take both sides of an argument, but then finding that middle takes a lot of work.
Yeah.
What is actually true?
Exactly. And sometimes we learn more based through documents we discover. For example, there was a lot of times in early Christian history where they argued with amongst each other and among a group called the Gnostics, who they talked a lot about.
Gospels.
And for a long time, all we knew about the Gnostics was just what their opponents written of them.
Which I think they were considered wrong.
Yes.
Heretics.
Yes. And then we discovered the Gnostics' own documents called the Nag Hammadi Library, and that's a crazy story how we discovered that, and that gave us a little more perspective on the issue. And that's why it's important to get both sides if you can. And the other thing to look at is, what do we know about the culture of the work that produced this writing? Was this a culture what did this culture value? Did this culture value, like we do, sort of getting things, just the facts? Or are they more about, what's the meaning of this event? What does this mean towards us? And also, what story are they trying to tell? Are they trying to just do poetry? Are they trying to, have a moral to say? Or
Right, like fables there are no talking squirrels that we know of.
Exactly.
But it's a message.
Yeah, that's why genre is so important. And that's part of the next thing I was going to talk about is, what's the purpose of the writing?
Right.
We should be really careful with this step because in our, Western, modern, postmodern minds, I guess you'd say, we often assume what we consider important onto the text and then judge it based on that, rather than trying to get into the writer's mind and what questions were they asking, what was their issue. And the final question to consider is, well, who wrote this piece? Who were they? What do we know about them? Does this work even have an author? A lot of stuff we have from ancient times doesn't have an author because the ancient world honestly didn't really care that much about authors. They were more about the story.
The story was more important than the author.
And plus, stories often developed orally first. It was, the whole society telling the story. And
so nobody knew where it came from.
Yeah. I mean, they might have a source, like there was this ancient figure that first did this.
But that ancient figure could be a combination of other ancient figures.
It could, yeah. And a lot of times, though, oral history could be fairly accurate because if someone tried to introduce something that was wrong, the whole, group can say, no, that's not how it went. But oral history passed down often gets put into books, is what I'm saying. And we need to consider that. And we still have that today. I mean, how many stories do you hear, around first before someone writes them?
Well, that's where the tall tales come in.
Yeah. And another issue with writing is it gets a little bit more philosophical because...
Interesting.
what's very interesting is that some philosophers, in fact, the very first philosophers, considered that writing might actually make us more stupid.
Wait, what?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. So here's the logic of it. Okay.
Wait, Phil. Okay.
Where you-
Philosopher, isn't that love of knowledge?
yes.
Wouldn't you want to know more by writing and reading?
So here's the thing they had. They considered that sometimes what you learn by writing actually might not be a good form of knowledge.
Interesting. And then there's that theory, the new study. Well, it's not new. It kind of goes back and forth. That writing on paper is better than like writing on a computer. And you learn better by writing on paper.
Exactly.
So that's interesting. I
So
don't retain everything I hear.
no, I don't either.
And I don't remember everything I wrote down either.
No, I barely remember a lot of what I write down.
Huh.
So the guy who first really started to complain about writing was a guy named Socrates, who, if you,
Socrates.
almost everyone has at least heard that name.
Right.
So he was a philosopher he liked to wander around Athens in the 5th century asking difficult questions. And he had a student named Plato, and he wrote down many of these sayings. And this is kind of ironic, and we'll get to that in a second. But Socrates really claimed that writing makes us forgetful, because we could just go back and read the information. We don't have to really know it and absorb it, like, in an oral tradition or like in a classroom. And that's honestly why there are still college classes today. I mean, why don't you just read about physics or read about, nursing or read about history? Well, sometimes you need to hear someone talk about it. And Socrates told this story about this guy named Phaedrus, who said, "Writing shares a strange feature with painting. The offsprings of painting stand there as if they are alive, but if anyone asks them anything, they remain most solemnly silent. The same is true of written words. You'd think they were speaking as if they had some understanding, but if you question anything that has been said because you want to learn more, it continues to signify just that very same thing forever. When it has once been written down, every discourse roams about everywhere, reaching indiscriminately those with understanding, no less than those who have no business with it. And it doesn't know to whom it should speak and to whom it should not. And when it is faulted and attacked unfairly, it always needs its father's support alone. It can neither defend itself nor come to its own support."
That's kind of a fair assumption because words on paper can be misconstrued easily.
Yeah.
And you say, well, it says what it says, but then there's like context and there's other stuff. You can't go back and look at the paper and be like, okay, explain yourself.
Exactly. And there's also the issue he had, which he really liked. He thought knowledge came through discussion. So I came up
Discussion is very important.
So I came up to you and I said, what do you think about this? What do you think makes people good? And then you would respond with something like,
Right. And then you'd have a back and forth. Mm-hmm. And then could come to a conclusion, probably not the ultimate conclusion, but as long as we're continue talking, it's better than just reading.
Right. And
reading is important, and it can be a conversation starter.
Exactly. And that's sort of the problem he had with writing, was that writing is just, it's there, you read it, you can't really engage. I mean, you can engage with it, but you can't really ask questions.
Mm-hmm. It requires everybody.
Which is interesting to think of. It's interesting to think what someone like Socrates would think of social media or something like that, where people can write something, but they can also engage with each other with it.
That is an interesting thought. What do you think he would think with... Because technically social media is writing, but it's also a back and forth.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think he would like elements of it. He would like how it's a combination of both. I think what he wouldn't like is because social media, this is something that a lot of people complain about. There's no opportunity to read facial signatures.
Yes.
The facial.
Yes.
Brain fart.
Yes. Facial, not features. Expression. And
facial expressions.
Thank you.
Nonverbal communication.
Which is a huge portion of communication.
Yeah. Another problem with, social media, and writing can have this problem too, is there can be a lot of bad faith actors.
That's true.
And what I mean by bad faith actors, for those who might not know that term, that's people who are engaging or arguing, and they're not doing it in good faith. They're not doing it, really engage with this point or disprove it. They're just doing it to scream at you, or they're pretending to care about something to, And this happens a lot in social media.
That does open up a can of worms.
It really does. But it's also very ironic that Socrates said this and Plato just wrote it down. Because
really?
we wouldn't know about it unless Plato wrote it down for us.
That's ironic. Mm-hmm. If I'm using that correctly, I can't remember.
That is ironic.
It is ironic. Okay. That's different.
And there's also the problem of, yes...
It's a catch-22.
Yeah. Yes, we learn knowledge more through discourse, but there is some knowledge that we would need to go back to, long time ago to learn from it.
Yeah.
I mean, how many times do people have an argument about something that people have been arguing about for centuries,
Right.
Like, a good example I can think of that is, to use a dark example, like, is torture effective? Like, that's something
that's very dark.
That's something that's been argued about for a long time, and actually, like, Frederick the Great of Prussia outlawed it in the 1700s because he said, well, it's not.
Yes.
And, people have been arguing about things related to politics, like questions about how much government should be involved, what should government do.
Right.
People have been having these sort of discussions for a very, 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 very long time. Mm-hmm. So it could be really useful to go back to see, okay, what did people think of it before then? 200, 300, even 1,000 years ago. So that's really where writing comes into play.
Right. But then you use that information to figure out what you're supposed to do.
Mm-hmm. And writing can also, be a way for a society to come together, especially societies that may not have a lot, but they have stories to tell.
Yes.
Like, what's a good example? I'm trying to think of a good example. Can you think of any, Katie?
Are we talking about, you said the Celts we don't know much about them. Are you thinking something like that, like their legends?
Yeah, something like that, but I'm trying to think of one, but
It's all right. We'll come back to it.
Yeah, I'm drawing up a blank.
So anything. Anyway.
Well, anyway. So here's a few things I want to leave you all with when you're thinking about history. And it's very common to just start thinking about history just as facts, events, words on a page like we were discussing.
Right.
But really, history is less about the actual stuff, and it's more about interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
Because we're looking at sources in archaeology and culture, and we have to interpret what that means. We have to look at the whole piece.
That's so hard.
It is hard to do.
It's very difficult.
It's hard to do in our own lives, even, just if we're looking at ourselves, like, what events have shaped us?
Right.
Where were we raised? What stories were we told? What people did we know?
Right.
What things did we learn? What experiences did we have? Mm-hmm. We are all pieces of history being written as we speak.
My brain is exploding.
But
it's a lot.
It is
true. It's a lot to think about.
Mm-hmm.
That you are part of history.
Yeah, and what a lot of people like to do with this is they'll take a singular event. Like, okay, I'll do a very good example that everyone can relate to. So, the American Revolution, 4th of July.
Right.
People will take that story and they'll say, okay, America is the greatest nation known to man because, we are about freedom. We revolted from a tyrannical government. Mm-hmm. We're not going to be run by a king. We are a republic. So they'll take that story and that will become sort of the anthem. And we see this, in national anthems and, nationalistic sayings, but that story becomes in many ways our identity. And a lot of cultures do this as well. Now, sometimes this can be a good thing because people can rally around stories and we can become better people. But it can also become a bad thing when those stories are used to exclude others, or they're used to corrupt others, or we ignore the real facts of the matter.
Right.
And one way we really do this is we'll take events that are really more uncertain or gray, and we'll add certainty to them. Like, we want to know who the bad guy is, who the good guy is.
And sometimes there isn't.
Yeah.
There isn't one. Both of them are trying to do their best.
Mm-hmm. And this happens a lot in
And it's
movies.
not even just a both. It can be more than one or the other.
And this happens a lot in movies based on history where they need a villain, so they'll just take some poor sap and just make them the villain of the story.
I heard that's why they did World War I for Wonder Woman. Because there's no... I mean, there's no clear dark side. Light side. At least according to historians.
Yeah.
Whereas World War II, it would have been a little easier.
Yeah, World War I is a little more gray, and it sort of works well for having a very optimistic character, like, well, they never call her Wonder Woman in the movie, but Diana to enter. So it's going to be very difficult to interpret these events. This is especially true when we look at the effects of what some event is or what some person did. But one other problem in history is that we need to decide who we're going to focus on when we're looking at it. And one theory that a lot of people follow is what's called the great men and women of history.
Normally men.
Normally
I'm just
men.
saying.
Yeah, normally they tend to focus on the men. And what great men history is all the focus is put on these great, huge, larger-than-life people being the driving force of history and events. So,
And that, one thing, when you said that, if you just focus on the great men of history or whatever during that time, then you kind of feel terrible about now. You're like, well, I'll never live up to that. Must be everybody during the revolutionary time, they lived like this. They were all like this. Everybody was just great.
yeah, and that comes a problem when we look at the greatest generation, for example. And the people say, back in the 40s and 50s, this was really great. We had all these great people doing all this stuff, and it's like,
And they did do great stuff.
Yeah.
Don't get me wrong. They were all the ones who did do great.
Yes, but there is a lot of other people involved. I mean, history is more than just, one or two great people.
Right.
But this can become a big problem in history textbooks. Like, if you take any history textbook you had from, I don't know, high school or even elementary, and page through it and look through the events, you'll often see big sections about, say, okay, here's one on George Washington, here's one on John Adams, here's one on Alexander the Great, or something like that. And it will just talk about those people, and it won't really talk about anything else. It might talk about some
It won't even talk
event.
about the people who helped them. They couldn't be great without other people behind them.
Yes, and this is a big problem with the great man theory. And this is actually... So we tend to think this is all sort of something we've come up with, the whole great man theory. But it goes back to the 1800s. And there was this guy who was called Thomas Carlyle. He was Scottish. And he came up with this theory that we should focus on the kings, queens, presidents, emperors, the rich, and these great people are the driving force of history. They are isolated actors who are the driving force. They drive all the events. And there are a lot of problems with this theory. The first, as you mentioned, is that no person is really an island. They're all influenced by people, where they come from, who they knew. And another problem with that theory is that we need to look at how they are what societal factors shape them. Like, it might be something like, if there was a big wave of illness that swept through an area, obviously that would influence, the upbringing of someone.
That's true.
Like, a good example I can think of that is that after the Black Death in Europe, and for those who don't know, the Black Death was essentially, there was this plague spread by rats that came into Europe in about the 1300s and killed a whole lot of people.
Weren't there a couple of them, or am I thinking of just the Black Plague?
Yes, the Black Plague swept up again and again throughout
Okay,
the
but the
ages.
Black Death was another thing.
The Black Death was all part of the bubonic plague, basically.
Okay.
And it had actually come around before that in several places, but the Black Death was the biggest outbreak that we know of. And what happened as a result of that event is that people, both historical figures, both the great people, to use that term, like, the nobles, and the people like the peasants, they all became after that a little bit more of like partiers, and they didn't care as much.
After you go through something like that.
Yeah, there was a lot more like, people would celebrate more, and there became more this idea, drink and dance because tomorrow we're going to die. And also,
sad.
even on a societal level, the peasants who were alive after that got a little bit of better deal because there weren't any much workers left, so the peasants could negotiate for higher wages and better living conditions. And also, a lot of wars during that time ground to a halt because, everyone's sick, no one can fight. So we need to look at events like that and see how they really shape the men and women who we're going to be looking at. Another problem with the great man and woman theory is that it can really ignore the people who are impacted negatively by these events.
That's true. For every great, there's something that's not so great.
Yeah.
Sorry, guys.
It's okay. It's allergy season.
It's that time of year again. I'm here with my tea that may have come about by accident. This tea came about on purpose, but
yeah, that tea I
itself came
boiled
about on accident.
So, for example, like, when we look at the Native Americans in American history, the colonization of America, yeah. So, obviously, they are, in many ways, were victimized by many events, so we also need to keep them in mind. There was a famous book called The People's History of the United States that looks more at the marginalized people, that approach to history. Mm-hmm. So, what are we going to do on this show?
What are we going to do? I didn't even know what we were doing until like an hour before we got here.
That's true. I barely knew what we were doing. So, what we're going to do is we're going to try to look at history from every perspective we can. Now, we're not going to get to all of them.
Clearly, we have so many years to go through.
Yeah, and obviously we're going to cover things that interest us. We're not going to cover, what's a good example of something that doesn't interest me? Yeah, I guess it doesn't pop into my head. Like, I don't know, like the 19th century textile industry or something like that.
I'm good. I really don't want to talk about the 19th century textile industry.
Or the history of corn.
That would actually be interesting, considering we are in Indiana.
That's true.
It would probably be like part of an episode if we ever do it. It would not be a full episode.
Or we could do History of Corn, the band.
Oh, that is a band.
Yeah, but with the K.
With a K. I don't think I've heard them.
Yeah.
Anyway.
So at times we're going to look at some big figures. We're going to look at the royal family of Britain and people like that. But we're also going to look at some lesser-known figures because we really want to highlight really cool people that did stuff that we might not necessarily know about. And we're always going to try to keep outside factors in mind. Like, we want to keep in mind society and religion.
Those are big, big factors, no matter where you are.
Right.
Those affect everything. How you think, how you interact, how you live your life.
Right. And, religion is also a very, very, very big thing we're going to have to look at because whenever we're talking about some event in history, like, the separation of church and state with America, we have to explain why they wanted that,
Right.
What was the history before that made them want that?
Yeah, you can't just burst out with that and have no context.
Yeah. And who were the people who liked it and who were the people who were opposed to it? Because separation of church and state, when it first emerged in American Revolutionary War, there was a huge group of people that really did not like it and thought it was the worst. And, we also have to...
Separation of church. They're thinking not a state church like the Anglican church, right? Is that what I'm thinking of? Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Where basically the idea
The
of
king was the leader.
Yes, and
Did
also...
that eventually die out, or is that still popular?
So, okay. It's kind of still around in some of the countries in the Middle East to a certain degree.
Okay.
And in Europe, it's gone, but there's
that's what I meant in
But
Europe.
there's still kind of like some, or like the Anglican Church, I think, still gets certain amounts of money from
Right.
taxation, stuff like that,
But it's not as big as it was.
No. Like, it used to be, the state and the church were like this. I mean, they were considered one supports the other. And, America obviously decided not to go that route, so we'd have to explain why they didn't want to go that route.
Okay.
And we're also occasionally going to talk about some controversial topics. Like, I have an episode planned for the Crusades, which is...
Oh, the Crusades.
The
Very controversial.
Very controversial.
Very sad.
Very complex. And what we really want to do is, obviously, we're going to have to talk about politics at times. That's inevitable. But I want to talk about it in a way that's not, partisan. I just want to describe things as best I can. Well, give it my own little, spin on it.
And that's fair.
Yeah. So that is basically Dank history.
Woohoo! It's fall. It's fall. It doesn't feel like fall. Fall 2019.
It really,
Woohoo!
it really doesn't, isn't it? 92 degrees outside.
It wasn't that bad. We went outside. Let me see what the weather looks like. I don't know.
Did you say fall 2015?
I said 2019.
Oh,
I did
I
not
thought-
say 15. I'm not that old. It's 82 right now, unless my thing's off.
That's not too bad.
On the computer, it says it's 0. So
Yeah, it is 0 degrees. We should all be home with a pot of hot chocolate.
yes,
A whole pot. Wait, I want to thank you all for joining us. And if you want to follow us on social media, we are on Twitter. We are at History Dank. That's capital H, capital D.
Was Dank history taken? I've been meaning to ask.
I think that tag, I think it might have been.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's History Dank.
Yeah, but it is called the Dank History Show.
Gotcha.
So once again, I am Bradley Cooper.
I'm Katie Cooper.
And thank you so much for joining us. And we will be back every Thursday.